Good morning, good afternoon, and good night, wherever you're tuning in. We are Slava and Jonathan, bringing you the Side Quest podcast, where we talk about character development, stories, and all things that are world building. And we occasionally take side quests, because, frankly, that's how conversations work. Just as a reminder, this whole show is spoiler heavy. So sit back, tune in, and join us on this episode of Side Quest. Welcome back to Side Quest. One quick note of housekeeping. This is going to be the first episode using the new template, which we worked on during our break. We hope you enjoy. We spent a lot of time on it, and we are trying to refocus in this new era on edutainment. And if you're not familiar with the term, edutainment means education, entertainment. So we're doubling down on education because we have been very lax in that around the elements and makeup of storytelling. That includes all the books we read. We will be focusing on unpacking the elements that make up the stories that we love and enjoy. Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, we reworked this to focus more on our audience and make this a more robust podcast, but we need your feedback to make this even better. Be sure to let us know that this new episode framework is something that works for you.
Wonderful. So part of this new episode framework is segments, and you'll get to discover them along the way. We're going to be reading Name of the Wind. Slava, have we read this book before?
We have, multiple times. I can even tell you how we got to reading this book.
Please do.
This book was the first book that you had me read in the fantasy genre, because I had shared with you that my exposure to fantasy was Lord of the Rings and Narnia, as I've said numerous times on the podcast before. But also connected to this was the conversation we had long before this project even started. We reconnected after a few months of not speaking because life and living across multiple states. And one of the questions you asked me, it was during COVID, one of the questions you asked me was, have you ever thought about starting a podcast? And I said, actually, this past couple of weeks, that's all I've been thinking about is who do I reach out to out of all my friends that I can start a podcast? We can kibitz, joke around, talk about stuff we like. That's how the conversation started about, well, what books do you like? Do you like fantasy? And my answer was just the one I described. And you said, well, I have a book for you. I have a couple of books for you. And you mentioned Sanderson and you mentioned Rothfuss specifically and said, let's read it and talk about it. I began reading it. My first read was a little slow going. By the end of the book, I loved it. And the second time around reading it for me, third time around actually, was wonderful. I enjoyed it immensely. So that's how we started on this journey.
Yeah, we actually tried to record this book 2 or 3 times before we even had a brand name for the podcast. And we realized really quickly that although our banter was fine, it wasn't great for people who weren't privy to our history. So we had to begin the journey, similar to Kvothe, of personal development in terms of podcasting.
Yeah.
So, Slava, can you give us a quick roadmap on this book that we're reading?
Yeah, for sure. So, as with most books, it's going to be 3 episodes with one guest episode. And that guest is our one and only favorite Spencer. He's going to come on part 3 of this book, and we're going to do the good old recap.
It might surprise people, but Spencer was actually pretty reluctant to reread this because he also audiobooks, similar to both of us. The first time he read it, he didn't like Name of the Wind. So I encouraged him to come on and let us know if he still doesn't like the book or if rereading it changed his mind. So I'm looking forward to that. But before we begin, make sure that you hit that subscribe button so that you never miss a side quest.
And this will determine if we have Spencer back on the podcast ever again. But why don't you give us a quick plot summary? We'll call it the publisher's plot summary because we want to explore the book as we go along. Why don't you give us that, Jonathan?
I'd love to. This is more of a unique publisher summary where it's written in the first person, which is not usually the case. My name is Quoth. I have stolen princesses back from sleeping barrow kings. I have burned down the town of Trabian. I have spent the night with Felurian and left with both my sanity and my life. I was expelled from the university at a younger age than most people are allowed in. I tread paths by moonlight that others fear to speak of during the day. I have talked to gods, loved women, and written songs that make minstrels weep. You may have heard of me. And so begins a tale unequaled in fantasy literature. The story of a hero told in his own voice. It is a tale of sorrow, survival, and one man's search for meaning in his universe, and how that search and the indomitable will that drove it gave birth to a legend.
And the man who gave this story to us is Patrick Rothfuss, who's had the good fortune to be born in Wisconsin in 1973, where the long winters and lack of cable television encouraged a love of reading and writing. To awesome parents who encouraged him to read and create through reading to him gentle boosts of self-esteem and deprivation of aforementioned cable television. Patrick matriculated at the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point, initially studying chemical engineering, which led to the revelation that it's kind of boring. After abandoning his chosen field, Pat became an itinerant student, wandering through clinical psychology, philosophy, medieval history, theater, and sociology. 9 years later, university policy forced Pat to finally complete his undergraduate degree in English. When not reading and writing, he teaches fencing and dabbles with alchemy in his basement. That is the man, the myth, the legend, who gave us this legend.
So, one of the segments we have here is, where did the author come up with this book idea, right? And so while I was doing some research, I stumbled upon an old interview with Patrick, and he looks a lot younger, he's happier, and he's a bit trimmer as well. It was around the time of 2007 or 2008 probably, so right shortly after Name of the Wind came out. It could have been a little later, so I apologize if the facts are a little off. The interview asked him a question about where he came up with his story, which is what I wanted to know, because I realized I didn't actually know. And he goes into a short tale about his childhood, where this came from, and he had kind of a joke that he said when he was giving his pitches, where he said, it's like The Princess Bride meets The Crow. It's the story of a man's life, and it's kind of a backstage pass to the myth of a hero, and you get to meet this person and find out the mythology that surrounds them, and find out how it really happened. And it's kind of a mixture between them. And then he backpedaled a little bit and shared about how he didn't think that was a very good pitch. So he then went on to just simplify it and say that it was a character-focused story, and the story is around a man's life. The myth that developed from that man measured against the things that actually took place, which I think is why we love this story, because you don't always get to see the development of a myth, the making of a person who exceeded expectations, did something great in their life, and then was built up over time to become the myth that is Kvothe the Bloodless. So it's a new take on the fantasy genre. He also mentioned during his childhood, he read pretty much every fantasy book he could get his hands on. And then as he started to get new books, he realized, I think I've read this before. He hadn't, but it's just that nobody had written anything unique in the fantasy genre for a very, very long time. So the dragons, princesses, and swords don't cut it after a couple decades, if not longer, in a genre. Somebody needs to come in, cast different lots to give us something new to dig our teeth into. I won't dive into the fantasy genre as a whole. Slava has actually done a little bit of research for us on that one today. Slava?
Yeah, for sure, Jonathan. And this is something that I appreciated about the book because of what I mentioned earlier, that dragons and princesses and swords are great, but I had my fill, and that's why I never went back into the fantasy after I read Lord of the
Right,
Rings
right.
and Narnia. But this is a very specific type of fantasy genre. It's called epic fantasy, and there are six, I would say, I've broken down to six specifics that make up the epic fantasy genre. And it's world building, it's detailed, it's immersive, and the cultures and histories of the people are very rich, including geography, and it probably varies to degrees depending on the book, what the author chooses to focus on, but the settings are immersive. Magic is integral to the world and often has complex systems or rules. Now, complex here is, a relative term. For some people, that might be something like what Sanderson has done, or it might be something that Rothfuss has done, which I think is less complex by my definition of it than Sanderson, but it has a system that follows rules. Usually it has large in life protagonists going on epic quests, facing formidable adversaries, and it has very specific themes that it wants to explore. It's more than just a hero's journey. The hero's journey is enveloped in themes like power, destiny, honor, free will, struggle between good and evil, those kind of things. And the scope of stories often span multiple volumes, which this is 3 volumes, and involve interconnected storylines. And we will see this with Dinah. She comes in and out of the story, and she's connected to Quoth from in different parts of his life. So that is a small example, but nonetheless, it is an interconnected storyline. And the influence of most authors, what I found is mythology, folklore, and history. And they use that to create their own original and expansive narratives. And that is, out of the 6 I mentioned, I think 5 out of the 6, Rothfuss checks those boxes right away.
Slavi, you gave us a definition of an epic fantasy genre, and you have these 6 categories: world building, magic, heroes and villains, themes, scope, and influence. And you mentioned in magic systems, you compared Rothfuss to Sanderson, and you said Rothfuss's was not as complex as Sanderson. And I want to know what makes you say that.
I qualified the word complexity, saying that in this particular case, it's a bit relative. I mean, complex means what it means. The definition is there.
Yeah.
So it's more than just 2 or 3 things, let's hope. But when I look at Sanderson, and I read 4 books by Sanderson, and I read 2.5 books by Rothfuss, comparing those worlds, it seems that it's easier to wrap my mind around what Rothfuss has built quicker than it is with Sanderson. Sanderson has the whole Cosmere, planets. Each planet has its own system. There's a lot more to each culture's understanding of the wider magical system in Sanderson's world, in the Cosmere. It's just a wider scope to the world, to the magic system. Where in Rothfuss, it's more consolidated to what I'm assuming is one planet and just a few geographical points, even though there might be vast, in context for Quoth, they might be a vast geographical landmass, whatever it is. It seems more grounded. It's not as fantastical, if you will. So that's what I meant by less complex.
Okay. That's fair. I was thinking about soft magic and hard magic systems, similar to what we've discussed in other episodes. But I was also thinking about Rothfuss's system as a whole. One fact that might not be well known to a lot of people is that Rothfuss built his magic system in a similar vein to Ursula K. Le Guin's magic system, which is the naming system, where everything has a true name. And when you learn that true name, you have control over it. And I hope to get into Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea series, which is that magic system I'm describing, at some point.
With as many times as you've mentioned her and I've heard her name in my research for Sanderson and for
Yeah.
Rothfuss, I want to get into
Yeah.
her. She seems like a fascinating person.
I don't know much about her as a person as much as I know about the Earthsea series specifically, but the pacing in the Earthsea series is a lot slower. So when we go through it, we might even need to create more episodes per book just to talk about the depth. I don't think it's complex, but the depth of what she was doing in the books. I also don't think that we've really read any female authors yet. Have we?
No, I don't think so. I can't remember a single one.
Okay, maybe we should bump her up on the list then. I feel like we should do that.
I think so.
Yeah. So, just a quick overview of the magic system before we dive back into the segments. We've got sympathy in The Name of the Wind, which involves binding, energy transfer, alar. How do they say it in the audiobook?
Alar, I think.
Yeah, okay. We've got binding, energy transfer, alar, and then applications of the sympathy that you're trying to do, which is very, very fun and actually reminds me of something that I wrote about in the beginnings of a sci-fi web series I was developing. Then you have naming, which is the true names of things, which is more intuitive and elusive as a magic system, and is also rarer because not everybody has the power to do it, and you have to become a relar to be recognized as someone who's a namer, because relar means speaking or saying. As far as we know in this book, it's a dangerous and unpredictable ordeal to happen.
Yeah, and this is something that's been throughout human history, right? Many myths exist in which one being has control of another through knowing its true name. Egyptian mythology, biblical context, other folklore traditions, even more modern names. For example, the fairy tale Rumpelstiltskin, in which the queen is only able to banish her tormentor when she has learned his real name. So the power of name comes from the idea that knowing something or some things, someone's true name, reflects a true understanding of that object, idea, or person. This understanding subsequently allows control over the named. This idea also shows up in Arthur C. Clarke's book, The 9 Billion Names of God, fantasy novels by J.R.R. Tolkien, Christopher Paoloni, I think I'm mispronouncing it, but Christopher Paoloni, and you know this more than I do, so maybe you can talk about this before we move on, is this theme also shows up in role-playing games such as Dungeons & Dragons.
It depends if you're playing a homebrew. I can't remember any books, any of the D&D storybooks where it's actually like a predetermined journey, predetermined quest that you go on as a group,
Okay.
where true names have been involved at all. But for some homebrews, there have been a few things here and there, but it's actually not as big of a trope as you might think in the fantasy gaming world. And I think it should be, because to your point, it's a tale as old as time.
Right.
There are a few more magic/science things that we learn about here in Name of the Wind, and that's sigildry, which I think is really interesting, alchemy, and artificing, where you're able to use the magic/science in the world to develop new technologies, for lack of a word, for lack of an in-world word. That will prove to be a useful avenue for plot development in Book 2. Slava hasn't read Book 2 yet, but I think that even in Book 3, we'll start to see more of Kvothe messing around with sigildry, alchemy, and artificing for making money as well as personal gain, which I'm looking forward to.
Right. Why don't you give us a little setup for the world that Rothfuss has built for us?
Certainly. We just finished talking about Rothfuss's magic system, as far as we know at the moment. And one thing that I realized I forgot was there's a Fey realm, or a fairy realm for those who are less familiar. But this book has a general fantasy feel. It also has a medieval feel because there's minimal technology. They're still using bows and arrows. We haven't heard anything about guns. People have swords and they regularly use them. But with the amount of culture and art that takes place in this world, it almost feels like a Renaissance period in the medieval times where you have troopers traveling from town to town and they have patrons, and the arts is a very big piece of the culture. Not only that, but there are widespread traditions throughout all the lands that people know, from small poems to folklore to mythology and songs. I remember growing up, there was a song, "Ring Around the Rosie." Kids don't have these songs anymore, it feels like, from what I can tell, because they all have cell phones. Which this was all like folklore education that got transferred to people. It was "Ring Around the Rosie, pockets full of posy, ashes, ashes, they all fall down." Unless I'm forgetting a line, Slava.
I think you got it.
I think that's it, right? And Slava can give us a little background here in a second on the actual "Ring Around the Rosie" meaning, because folklore is often made simple enough for other people in the community to memorize, so that it's also spread quickly and people know what is being talked about, but it needs to be memorable in some way, which is why Rothfuss employs regular use of poetry throughout the book, which is fun, unique, and adds to the breadth of the world and the culture. One last note I have here for setting up the world is that it's a world full of culture, commerce, and magic, where we see time and time again Foth is struggling to get by with a bent shim at some point, where he doesn't have any money for anything. He only owns 2 shirts, and the poverty in the time frame that he lives in, both present and past when he was growing up, are hard pressed realities that he had to engage with. And I think that that is one of the pillars that makes this a more believable world, because most of the people that I know, at least at some point in their life, have had moments of poverty. Hopefully shorter, but they've had moments of poverty. So that's a little bit of setup for the world. And Slava, why don't we pause for a second and do another quick side quest on "Ring Around the Rosie"?
Yeah, for sure. Well, you did miss a line, and I missed a line.
Uh-oh.
It's "Ring Around the Rosie," or "Roses." There's 2 versions, same thing. "Ring around the roses, a pocket full of posies.
Oh, yeah.
A tissue, we all fall down." So, at the blog called the Londonist, it describes these 5 London nursery rhymes depicting death and ruin. And this is one of them in question. So, a guy named James Fitzgerald, he's apparently a scholar on these things, he states that this rhyme arose from the Great Plague that affected London in 1665. This is what he says: "Ring around the roses" is all about the Great Plague, the apparent whimsy being foil for one of London's most atavistic dreads. The fatalism of the rhyme is brutal. The roses are a euphemism for deadly rashes. The posies are supposed to be a primitive measure. A tissues pertain to the sneezing symptoms, and the implication that everyone's falling down is, well, death.
Yeah. Common folklore that ends up sharing with us a little bit about history and what people went through the use of metaphor and childhood nursery rhyme.
Well, childhood nursery rhymes were a lot more darker when we were kids. Well, they weren't new from where our parents or grandparents were kids. They were passed down to us.
Yeah.
I remember reading Grimm's fairy tales.
Mm-hmm.
The girl with the red shoes, when she puts on the magical shoes, she can't stop dancing. They have to chop off her feet. Like, well, that escalated quickly.
She probably stole the shoes, huh?
Probably. I don't remember. A long time ago. Just a darker way to tell stories. And even though Disney has co-opted some of these stories and made them into fairy tales with very happy endings, a lot of them had darker meanings and darker lessons, life lessons, if you will. You might argue that, oh, why would you tell this to a child? You'll traumatize them. But I look at like the church I go to. They have a cemetery next to it. And kids of all ages and adults of all ages walk past the cemetery to get to the sanctuary. And it's meant to remind you that your time is finite. It's not meant to be macabre. Like nobody's trying to scare anybody. So I think the way we tell stories, the point of stories has changed, good, bad, and indifferent. But one thing we're missing from tales of old is the more brutal realities of life. And we get that with Quoth. Like we'll jump into it over the next 3 episodes, but Quoth leads a brutal life. Not because he's brutal, but he's been brutalized. He leads a difficult life, if we want to use a softer term for it.
Yeah, that's fair. That is fair. So I just spoke about the world itself in Name of the Wind that Kvothe is living in, both past and present. With the stories that he tells from the past and the story that's taking place in the present, and even the traditional folklore that's shared throughout the story, did it feel alive? Did it feel believable to you, Slava?
It certainly did. And I think it's because the history of the world is revealed through stories within the books. So we have the songs that are sung in the book. We have the tales about the Calandrians. We have other myths in the book. We have Quoth telling a story to a chronicle that's about him in the past and correcting some of the myths that's been told about him. There's music that's intertwined with the narrative. The magic systems are grounded in realism, and I'm doing air quotes. This is a fantasy book. But I think because of Rothfuss's engineering background, all the other subjects he studied for 9 years at university, I think they're grounded in realism. And what I mean by that is not that they are believable per se, that they can happen in the real world, but the way he constructed them, they are believable in world. He's made a world that is well put together. It's believable. And naming and sympathy, they're the key magic elements, the magic systems that you mentioned. And in world, again, the medieval era technology that's kind of, being built, and we get a mention of this when Quoth looks down at a lute player that's about to stand on stage, and he has an older lute. And he describes how that lute was improved upon the new lutes they have now. So all those things, here's where it gets a little more complex. Going back to the complexity conversation we had just a few minutes ago, here's where it does become more complex. And all that together makes for a believable world. Even though I still stand by my statement about the magic system itself is more grounded than, let's say, Sanderson, in the best possible meaning of that word. The rest of it builds everything up. The world, the culture, how these people interact, why some believe in myths, why some don't. There's even some so-called atheists in the story where they don't believe in the gods, they don't believe in the church. There's a church, apparently. Even the superstitions about the university and the arcanists, all that makes for a believable story. It's grounded. It is full. Meat on the bone. You guys have heard me say this in reference to a lot of things in stories. It has meat on the bone. Whether it's character development, world building, this world has meat on the bone. But I want to ask you, Jonathan, you're the one who recommended this book to me. What about the world? The way, maybe even be specific, the story within the story. How does that help you get immersed into Rothfuss's world here? You talked about the medieval era, the widespread mythology, the tradition, the magic systems, which you know more about than I do. How does the stories that these people tell in world help you get immersed into Quoth's shenanigans, his adventures.
Some of the ways, and I'll just rattle them off, they're not necessarily in a prioritized order. When you got a local set of folks who come into the local tavern and they talk about the same things, just the same myths about Kvothe, they talk about the same things of, how is the road to Tinue? Common phrase where the first time you and I read it, we're like, well, it sounds bad. Everyone's impoverished and there's, mercenaries on the road plus whatever these black scralings are. And then we find out how is the road to Tinue simply means how are the travels? How are you doing? It's just a normal thing that you ask people and you go, oh. And from that moment on, you're starting to get immersed into the culture and the vernacular yourself. So you've got a local set of folks in the present day. You've got common phrases and language. You've got common traditions and poetry that is recited. You've got traveling troubadours, and if you've never been to a circus before, you should check it out. It's a good time. It's really fun to go check out the traveling circus or the traveling fair. They're different, but both are a good time. So it's things like that. And even more so, the poetry gets to me because I used to write some poetry, but not as good as Rothfuss, and not always using iambic pentameter, which shout out to those of you who read Shakespeare and know what iambic pentameter is. But these stories of old were often written in a limerick type fashion, not just things like childhood nursery rhymes, but other ancient texts were written in a verse and rhyme metric so that it was more memorable to people, because for some reason, and I don't have the research on this, but feel free to drop it in the comments if you do, it's easier to memorize something when it's put to a tune. I don't know why, it just is. It's part of how we are built. Many philosophers and ancients have both noted that music is a transcendent activity. That's not even giving it the weight that it deserves, because if you really let yourself sink into it, then it will take you to another state of being, another state of mind. And that is fascinating to use as a plot device where the Chandrian come and destroy Kvothe's family and ruin his life, basically, because somebody, to quote, because somebody was singing the wrong types of songs, end quote.
Yeah, music is fascinating, and I love that it plays such a key role in the plot, and it almost frames the narrative in some sense. Even Quoth himself, he is part of a singing troupe. He is a musician. So you have the main protagonist as a musician. You have these songs and limericks that have been written about him. There's these songs that are supposedly not to be sung. So there's an aura of mystery. And the song that he sings that wins him the golden pipes, it's supposed to make minstrels weep. That means the people who do this for a living, it's supposed to send them into another realm. It brings them to tears. And it's such a powerful song that his friends are crying. Everybody at the bar is crying. All the patrons are just swept up into the story that this music tells. And something you said that I think is absolutely true is music is transcended. I think about the songs that I love. They tell a story. They tell a story. We mentioned this a few episodes ago, where the Handsome Family is a new band that I found.
Mm-hmm.
It's a man and a woman, and their songs tell a story. And their songs tell a story in few words. It's not a long, drawn-out story like you'd get with Meatloaf, which I'm not knocking Meatloaf. He's a 70s, 80s rock, epic rock kind of artist, but they're more condensed. And maybe that's what I meant when I was talking about complexity between Sanderson and Rothfuss's magic system. Rothfuss is more condensed. So this Handsome Family, their songs are just so more condensed. It does take you to a new plane. If it takes me out of where I am right now and like puts me into a different plane, and I'm just able to relax and enjoy the music, the beat, the lyrics, it just takes you away. And that's part of the story that songs tell.
Yeah, that's true. What kind of songs do you guys listen to? Do you ever dive into old music, like from the 20s or 30s? Or are you mostly listening to that hip and hoppin' 2024 music with, I don't even know what kids listen to today. What
I don't know.
hip hoppity, don't stoppity, something or other.
Yeah.
Back in my day, we were listening to punk rock. But honestly, it was like pop punk. Wasn't even really.
Yeah. Yeah, back in my day, and I'm only a few years older than you, it was all alternative. So Nirvana,
Yeah.
Pearl Jam, Cake.
Cake.
And not all of them will fall under the
No.
umbrella of alternative, but Cake, Smashing Pumpkins, Crash Test Dummies. I used to like them. Violent Femmes. Now I'm all over the place. These are all different genres.
Yeah.
But that's what I grew up with, and that shaped my musical proclivities.
Blue Oyster Cult.
Preferences. Yep. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves and join a minstrel, let's get back to the structures of the book, specifically plot structures, and how Rothfuss uses different structures to help unfold the narrative.
For those who don't know, plot structures, put simply, would be the frameworks for how a story unfolds or a narrative unfolds. In Name of the Wind, 3 of the top plot structures that we see that are very blatant and clear to us is it has a frame narrative, a non-linear timeline, and a Bill Dukes Roman framework. It's a very weird word. I stumbled upon it when I was doing some work to prep for this episode, and I'll explain them in order that I spoke about them and elaborate on Bill Dukes Roman style books. So what's a frame narrative? A frame narrative is where a novel uses the main character, so Kvothe in this instance, to recount his life story, and he's sharing it to chronicler. We get that in chapter 5, I think, or 6. It's like very early on where he's like, hey, I want to hear your story. This framework sets the stage for the true narrative, the primary narrative, which in this instance, and to go back to what Rothfuss said, is the story is about a man who became a legend and the myth that spawned from that compared against the actual events that took place. Chronicler has found Kvothe hiding in Nowheresville, corner of the world, and Kvothe has agreed, reluctantly, to share his story, and Chronicler has the myths, but he's going to get the real story. So it's framing the primary narrative when Chronicler says, Kvothe, will you tell me your story, to put it in simpler terms. The next framework that we see is the non-linear timeline, and it flows easily into this after the frame narrative because Kvothe is going to tell us his story about his upbringing, his childhood, and he's telling it chronologically. But we get pulled out of it to go back to the main present day with our common villagers coming to the local tavern and then some traveling troopers who also stop in the tavern, moments when Chronicler needs a break or Bast needs to do something. In the nonlinear timeline, it allows us to take a deeper look at the differences between the character we're being told about in the past, of Kvothe as a child, versus Kote, a common innkeeper. Not only is it just Chronicler helping bring this out, but Bast is a third wheel here, trying to really bring back his Reshi, which we find out later in the book, because he apparently has sent out little notes in a bottle to leave the town, to try to bring someone here to remind Kvothe that he's not Kote, some common innkeeper. He's Kvothe, the Bloodless.
Yeah, the one who burned down the town of Traben and stole princesses back from Barrow Kings. That guy?
Yes, that Kvothe. But apparently, he's forgotten himself. And in a moment, after I explain the third framework, we can get into what we've now started calling the main quest, which is the story itself. And we can talk about the identity crisis that our main character has. But more on that in a moment. The last plot structure that is incorporated into this book. And these are not the only three. I want to emphasize that. They're just the three that I picked out to talk about. There may come a time where we rediscuss books that we've looked at in the past and have episodes on in hopes of continuing to unpack and discover their elements of storytelling hidden within.
Yeah, maybe like a Sanderson book or something that we've done early on in the history of this podcast.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
So the last plot framework is Bildungsroman type stories. Now, you may have never heard of this before. I certainly hadn't before I was looking up types of frameworks and how they fit into The Name of the Wind in particular. The Bildungsroman framework is the type of story that follows a coming-of-age journey. So in this case, Kvothe, as a kid growing up, makes it a Bildungsroman story where it traces his development from childhood or troubled childhood into a legendary figure. This is a very specific type of, they called it a genre when I was looking it up, but I would say it's more of a framework. And I'm happily willing to be wrong about this if you know more than I do. I'm willing to learn from anyone else in the audience who knows more about the Bildungsroman framework or genre, where you see psychological and moral growth from your protagonist because you get to see them at a young age stepping into adulthood. Rothfuss does this backward because we meet the adult Kote, who happens to be the youth Kvothe, who ends up eventually, at the peak of the story, becoming a legend. Kvothe the Bloodless, who stole back princesses from Barrow Kings and spoke with gods, right? Met with Felurian, left with his sanity and, what was the second one?
Spent the night with Felurian, left with both my sanity and my life.
He met Felurian and left with his sanity and his life. This person is a person of legend, but we see the reverse where we meet him in the present day and he's a washed up nobody, and then he tells us about his upbringing that leads to him becoming a legendary figure. And he very much played into the rumor mill to make sure that people exacerbated who he was and what took place.
Right, and for a couple of reasons. One reason being he wanted to cover his identity, obfuscate it, if you will, and then to use it to his advantage. If people thought he was more powerful than he really is, that played into whatever he was doing, which, good on him.
Yeah, and when you're an orphan, you have to do whatever you can to survive.
Absolutely. This is the first time I'm hearing of this framework, too, and we've talked on this podcast extensively about my love for a good coming-of-age story. Taking a kid and putting them in harrowing situations and that being the catalyst for their growth throughout the story. I'm drawn to those kind of stories. So I liked Kvothe's journey, obviously, but now I have a fancy literary word thanks to Jonathan. Imagine saying this to the next time you're at a book club or at a dinner party or whatever, and books come up as a conversation piece, and you just say, yeah, I really am into these new building. Well, how do you say it? I can't even say it now. Bildungsroman books. I'm really into those right now.
And they're going to go, huh?
Uh-huh.
What? Yeah.
Oh, you don't know? You don't know?
Yeah. What kind of a book club am I part of? I would say that it is probably the type of book that falls into this category.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
If I were to take the way that it was shared. Similarly, other popular stories that you might be familiar with that are this type is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte and To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. The first one, Jane Eyre, follows the growth of Jane Eyre from orphan childhood into strong, independent woman. To Kill a Mockingbird follows Scout Finch and her moral and emotional growth as she navigates the complexities of prejudice and justice within her community from childhood as she grows up.
Yeah, To Kill a Mockingbird was a transformative book in my life. I really enjoyed reading it. Because around this time, I was in a school where I was fortunate enough to have an amazing history teacher. And we learned a lot about American history. And by that, I mean the good, the bad, and the ugly. We didn't shy away from any of the darker sides of our history. And the teacher, would give us specific books to read, whether it was around the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, civil rights movements. He would give us specific books to read to help us understand kind of the zeitgeist of the time. And this is book I think I read in 2 or 3 days as a kid. I just devoured it. It was such a good primer. No, not a primer. I'm not exactly sure of the word, but it was immersion. It was such a good immersion into that sliver of American history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's certainly a page turner if you haven't read it before. And the further we distance ourselves from that era, I think it seems more and more to cause a pause in us and see sort of the depravity of what humans can do to each other.
People don't think about this in the conversations about race and race relations. There's so much that get lost in the fog. To Kill a Mockingbird takes place in the 1920s or 30s. So that's about 100 years ago. But even around 70 to 80 years ago, there were still parts of the South where the events described, the hostilities described in the book, were alive and well.
Yeah, it still takes place in sparse parts of podunk areas, sadly, and even some larger metropolises, usually south of the Mason-Dixon line, which is sad. But anyway, we should probably add that to the list to discuss at some point. I feel like there's a lot to talk about there.
I think so.
Well, we've reached the part where we talk about the main quest. Slava, do you want to help us dig into that to start?
Yeah, for sure. So we meet a guy named Coat, an innkeeper in a little podunk town. And we quickly find out that Coat has a fantastic backstory, and his actual name is Quoth, and he's part of the Dema Rue, which is a traveling troupe of singers and actors, and that he has a fantastic memory, very adept at learning. And on his travels, he meets a man named Ben, who is an arcanist. This guy is the one that serves sort of as a second father figure to him. So he learns about the life of an arcanist and how to interact, how to use the world's magic system and the sciences. And Ben actually insists, challenges Quoth to go to university because he sees potential in Quoth. We learn pretty quickly on that his family was killed by the Chandrians, which are these mythical creatures from children's stories, but they're actually not that mythical and are alive and well and part of this world. And after the death of his family, Quoth becomes a street waif in a neighboring town to where this murder took place, and he has to beg, borrow, and steal in order to survive. He lives through a winter in this city as a street waif. He finds a man named Thomas who takes care of kids, and slowly, with Thomas, he begins to see that not everything in the world, even though this is a difficult world, a harsh world, not everything in the world is as bad as it seems. The next man in his life that guides him is called Scarpy. And Scarpy is a storyteller. And during one of these story sessions, at which Scarpy gets arrested for heresy, Quoth gets the cobwebs knocked off his eyes. And he decides that he can't live in the past. Memories are not as bitter as they seem to be. And he needs to move forward. So he decides to go to university, just like Ben challenged him to in a note he wrote him before Ben left the troupe. And so he makes his way to university, gets in a fantastical type of way, gets in at a younger age than anybody else before him got in, gets tuition paid for, and gets extra money as a stipend because he was able to pass the test so well, as he begins his life at the university, it's apparent from the get-go that his new life is similar to his old life. You're always fighting for survival. Because of his hubris and being young, he makes friends, but also makes a lot of enemies, mostly due to his hubris. And he makes enemies of 2 masters of the university and 1 noble named Ambrose, affectionately named Jackass.
Penny for a ride.
Penny for a ride. And we go in between present tense and past tense as he's telling the story to the chronicler. Something that drives Quoth is naming. It's something that got him in trouble with Ben, and where we meet up with him at the end of our section, where we find ourselves with him at the end of the section, is Quoth is asking one of the masters, named Elodin, that he wants to study naming. But Elodin is both evasive and tricky, and when he finally pins him down, Elodin takes him to a large manor called the Haven, which is the university's asylum. And Elodin kind of plays this hard to get, you have to prove to me that you're worthy of studying under me type of game with him, and tells Quoth to step off the roof, and then I will teach you. And Quoth steps off the roof and breaks a couple of ribs. We find ourselves in this section with Quoth doing what Quoth has been doing for the past few months, trying to get information, specifically the Chandrians, but also to learn as much as he can in order to exact his revenge against the Chandrians who killed his family. That's kind of a broad overview of where we started and where we find ourselves with Quoth, roughly the middle of this book.
Yeah. It's been a journey so far, right? The setup is longer than most people want, but it's an epic fantasy, and epic fantasies usually have longer setups because you're new to the world.
Absolutely. And broad, and also at about 10,000, if not 50,000 foot view, because there's so much packed into every story that I mentioned just now. There's pages devoted to it. Even the beginning 3 or 4 chapters, we're still in present day world before Chronicler comes along, and Chronicler has something happen to him on the road up to Quoth. He's robbed by some mercenaries, some deserters from the army. So there's a war going on. There's these demon spiders that are around. There's travel on a particular road that's known to be hazardous. Quoth is dealing with his own internal demons. He has an apprentice named Bast, who we find out is a prince of the Fey realm, or a prince of the court of the Fey realm. So we have those storylines going on. We have his story about his parents. Even before we meet Ben, his time with Ben. There's a farmer that tries to help him in between him becoming a waif. There's a lot of moving parts. And there's like 2 or 3 stories about Ambrose before Ambrose, becomes a full-fledged enemy.
Yeah.
So a very tightly packed story.
Yeah. What do you think Bast is up to in the story?
Well, Bast is trying to get Quoth to become Quoth again, or Coat, right? This innkeeper to reclaim his former glory, his former life.
Why?
And how they meet is interesting. Why? Probably because of what's going on in the world. Spiders are coming out of the woodwork. There is rumors of wars. There's actually wars because we have deserters. Mm-hmm. The world is a harsh one. We already mentioned that. But there's something happening again. And these events might be the consequences of some of Quoth's actions. If they are or they aren't, Bast seems to be interested in getting Quoth to take on whatever role he was playing. It's bigger than an innkeeper in his previous life.
Yeah, Bast is the prince of the Fey court, one of them, because there are multiples, which we'll learn a little bit about in book 2. We don't know a whole lot about why he's the apprentice. We don't know a whole lot about what he's trying to do outside of what you've stated, where he's trying to get Coat to remember his identity, basically. But Coat takes responsibility for the mess of the world, which later in book 2 we meet the Cathay. You can consider the Cathay. It's not this, but I'm going to give you an example to start giving you some context for it. It's kind of like the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland.
Okay.
Mischievous, but it's tied to the tree that it lives in. It both can't speak untruth and has to... Not untruth. I'm trying to remember because I haven't read book 2 in a while. Anyway, the Cathay is a really interesting thing that when it tells you stuff, you're not supposed to believe it because it's prophecy but not prophecy.
It's not actualized prophecy. It's a possibility.
Yeah, but it's also like going to happen but not going. It's a we'll unpack it more.
So it's Matrix.
It's...
This is pretty much the Oracle from the Matrix.
Give or take, right? Like it's circle or the
Okay.
egg. You were there, you're not there. The spoon bends, but you bend, right? Something like that.
Is he gonna break the vase if she didn't say anything, kind of type of deal?
Give or take. But Bast gets upset when he finds out that his Reshi spoke to the Cathay. Because in the Fey realm, nobody speaks to the Cathay, ever. No, for no reason, nobody speaks to it. What was my point here? So, backing up, Bast, even though he knows lots of things, doesn't know as much as he thinks he does because he's kind of just mostly mischievous. So, I'm looking forward to book 3, whenever that's going to come out, where we learn more of like what Bast is doing. Even though in the last year, Rothfuss did let out, he did a re-release of The Lightning Tree, which is a character story about Bast in the town that he lives in. And it's similar in the sense that it's a character story to what he wrote about Ari in The Slow Regard for Silent Things, but it is not the same writing style. It's a normal story writing style, which is good. But we don't really learn a whole lot about Bast there either. Bast is just a mystery still of what he wants and what he's doing, other than he's a prince of a fey court.
So how does a prince become an apprentice?
Great question. Probably with that piece that we read earlier about, he slept with Florian, left with his life and his mind and his sanity, and that's unheard of. Florian, I think, has to reveal herself, if I remember correctly. That's what we know about Bast. What about the other characters we've got? We've got Coat, we've got Chronicler, we've got Jacob. What's the old man's name again?
Cobb.
Corn on the cob. Oh, what a kooky old man. Love him.
And the fact that we open up with Cobb telling the story, right, in this medieval bar, medieval, air quotes, and there's people around him, and it's the regulars from the town, and he is regaling the youngsters, some of them not so young.
And scolding them. Jacob, who's telling this story, Jacob? You or me? Do you want to finish telling the story, Jacob?
And some of them have heard the story before, some of them maybe have not, for whatever reason. But he's the old guy that knows everything about everything, I guess. Thrown into the story with a story being told, and then it's interrupted because Traveler, one of the town folks, comes in and says that the demons, the spiders,
Skraeling,
are here. So now wherever Quoth has escaped, we get the setup that Quoth is escaping something. He knows enough about these spiders to make me think that that's what he's escaping. Whatever the hell's going on in this world that these spider things are connected to, he was trying to get away from that, and now it's come to roost at his door.
Yeah, and he takes responsibility for that too. They exist because of him, and he has like a subtext conversation with Bast early on, where Bast gets upset that he went and left and did it himself, and then he's like, wow, this is kind of my fault, so figured I should probably deal with it, in not so many words.
Yeah. I remember that.
Yeah.
That's how he runs into Chronicler, too.
Right. Where he basically saves him. Not basically. He does save him. I don't know why I said basically. But he saves him from the Skraeling. These weird, not obelisk, but like round... I think of Kabuto from Pokemon. This like fossil Pokemon creature that's like a cylinder, but in all black. Like a black obelisk, formless color black. It's so black.
Okay.
That's the way that I picture it. I could be wrong, with its creepy little legs. One of the things I wanted to add to the main quest here is starting to dissect a little more with the audience the elements that make up a story. Most authors are in agreement that the things that make up a story are, well, the story framework, let me specify, is there's a setup, an inciting incident, which is what kicks the story off, and then there's the climax and the resolution. That's like the general consensus. Now, there's also the 3-act structure and a few other things. But for this conversation, because we're only in the first half of the book, we've been discussing the setup with what happens in present time, and then chronicler convinces Coat to reluctantly tell his story. So we are getting the setup of who this man is as an innkeeper, and then who this man is when he was young, and then who this man is when he was young and his parents were dead. And then that death of his parents, the death of a troop, is the inciting incident, because the inciting incident is what kicks a story off. So you can have the information about, oh, he's got a lot of skills. He learned a lot of things from his traveling troubadour troupe, where they taught him knife throwing and language speaking and memorization and playwriting, and not playwriting, but play memorization and singing songs and playing instruments. And then he learns, like Slava said, Ben teaches him about alchemy and being an arcanist lightly, and the alar and some sigildry a little bit. It's those things that set us up, and we go, wow, this character's really well-rounded. They know a lot of things. There's a lot of skills. And that's all in the setup stage before his parents die, before the inciting incident, which is why the first time I read it, I was like, oh, this book's so slow, because it takes like 16 chapters to get to the inciting incident.
And that's a hell of an inciting incident.
It is.
The kid's family gets killed. All his close friends get killed. This is just after Ben left. He thinks he caused Ben to leave sooner than he would have. And he probably did, because after he tries to name the wind and almost gets himself killed, that's when the relationship between him and Ben changes, and noticeably. And Ben leaves after that. Make of that what you will. But he's walking around moping, and this troupe tries to teach him all sorts of skills, from japing to tumbling to stage training, swordplay, and etiquette, which is part of his normal life. But now they kind of up the ante to get his mind away from Ben. And as slowly as that's working, I think it's working, he comes back from collecting sticks or whatever his parents sent him to collect, to find that everything has been turned to hell. He returns to camp at night, at sunset, only to see bodies strewn around, the smell of blood, the smell of burning hair. And he says, I will spare you the burden of any of it if one piece were not necessary to the story. It is vital. It is the hinge upon which the story pivots like an opening door. In some ways, this is where the story begins. So the inciting incident is the murder and destruction of everything he knows and holds dear.
Yeah, and Rothfuss, even with that line, tells us, hey, this is where the story actually starts. But it's interesting because for us, the story starts when we read the first sentence. You know, the first paragraph about the patient cut flower sound of a man who's waiting to die. That's when the story starts for us, but it's not when the story actually starts. It's the breakdown of how story engages with us. Up until this point, if he ends the book and the Chandrian don't kill his family, right? It just, Ben leaves, that's it. That's the story. And it's about a guy who's kind of washed up and he's telling you about his childhood. You go, oh, well, okay. To your point, he ups the ante here because Rothfuss, as an author, slaughters his family with a make-believe fairy group that is not really believed to be true, not really believed to be real. I don't know how you'd say that.
Like that. Yeah, they're part of children myths and, songs and stories. Nobody really takes them seriously unless they're a little daft.
Yeah, but it happens to be the fact that they're real. Man, that's it's like at that point where it becomes a page turner to me. The thing is, he doesn't skimp on the fact that Kvothe has been traumatized. He has grief that's unresolved. He becomes a shell of a person. The life he has to go through from this moment on, before university, it's tough. It's really tough to hear a kid have to survive in the wilderness, process his own grief and trauma. You just go, like, it builds so much compassion for the character, right?
Yeah, it does give us compassion for the character because we see him walking around like an automaton.
Yeah.
Right? And he says, what does he say? There are 4 doors to cope with pain.
Oh yeah, that's a good. Do you have that up? That's a good spot.
Our minds cope with pain, Quoth relates, through 4 doors: sleep, forgetting, madness, and death. And following the death of his family, Quoth wanders into the forest and sleeps. His mind is also dull, and it's trying to hide the more painful parts of the experience of the murder of his troop and his parents. He has dreams where his old friends give him survival instructions. The woodsman gives him instructions on edible plants, and he seems to be going through life in a fog, which is understandable.
Yeah.
The only thing that gives him a little bit of reprieve here is playing his lute. And we talked about this a little bit earlier in the episode, where that lute is his only connection to his past life, or a lute. Playing the lute. That is his only connection to his previous life, because everything is just destroyed. And after 3 years in the streets, and then in this pursuit of the Chandrians, all his exploits at the university, he's single-minded or focused on finding out more and exacting revenge. So there's no return to his old life. It's not like, yeah, I had this horrible time as a waif, but I found another troop, and they were like a second family to me. His life changes completely with no return back. But he still has fondness of those times and fondness of his parents, so playing the lute is the only thing that gives him any peace.
Yeah, it helps him stay grounded as much as he's able to, which is not a whole lot. Have you ever had a time in your life where you had to, like, help yourself get regrounded?
Yeah. Yeah, I have.
What was your lute? You don't have to regale us with, like, the details, but, like, what was the thing that regrounded you?
I don't know if I had a lute. I think maybe I had like a Scarpy moment.
Oh.
As I was processing the thing that was happening.
Was it shrimp scampi?
There it is. It was shrimp
Shrimp
Scarpy.
scarpy.
But I realized that I can be as angry as I want to be, and I had every right to be angry, but what I need to do for myself and for my wife is to get out and move past what was happening and get ourselves out first of the situation that we were in. And that is what spurred me on. I'm not a very sentimental person, so I don't have lutes. I mean, I have things that I enjoy, like reading books, watching movies, listening to music is a big thing for me. I already mentioned that. It helps me escape. So a song that tells a good story helps me just kind of get into this mode of complete peace. And I had those things, but there was not a lute moment. There was just a Scarpy moment where I was like, yep, this can't go on. We need to get the hell out of this situation and fast. What about yourself? Do you have a lute in your life?
Well, probably. I mean, I guess I would say that these books, the fantasy books, and I think I've spoken about this in some previous episodes, probably Name of the Wind, or this is Name of the Wind. Well, probably here.
Welcome to SideQuest, everybody.
Probably right here, right now, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is your lute moment?
This is my lute moment. This is keeping me grounded. Journaling keeps me grounded. I am a big proponent, and I think everybody should journal because it teaches you how to think. Because you can write down, I feel sad, and then you go, I don't feel sad. I'm angry. But the anger feels like sadness. And then you start correcting, you start editing yourself to basically what you're doing is you're refining your thought. So that helps me stay grounded. But rereading these fantasy novels, whether it's Cradle, whether it's Stormlight Archives, or somewhere else in the Cosmere, whether it's Name of the Wind or the Gentleman Bastards series, there are these transcendent moments for me listening to these main characters go through harrowing times, sheer struggle that speak to me, as well as some personal motivational books. One of Slava's favorite authors, David Goggins, has a really difficult story. And it's those moments where I go, this person's story is worse than mine in some specific ways and better than mine in some specific ways, and he was able to pull himself out. So I think I can pull myself out too. It's basically, grounding for me is looking for a tribe that doesn't exist in my real life where I can, and I'm kind of just like uncovering this as I'm saying it, but we all want people who understand us, right? Like that's a human connection thing. And because I don't know a lot of other people with a birth defect, because I don't know a lot of other people who have body complications because of that, and the things that has caused me to deal with in life, whether it's being made fun of or not being able to go to sleepovers or pool party embarrassment or like body image stuff because of the scars, I needed characters to be in my tribe, as it were, to go, hey, it's bad. I get it. But if you can strengthen yourself, you can get out of this because it's mostly a mindset. It doesn't change the fact that you have a birth defect at the moment. It doesn't change the fact that you have to still endure the things that are in front of you. But those are the things that I go back and reground myself with. I quote this stuff to myself, and it sounds stupid and it sounds dumb and nerdy or whatever, but like when I'm running, when I'm like doing a season of running, I will quote Way of Kings when Kaladin steps to the front and he says, Rock, get out of the way. I'm bridge leader. It's my privilege to run at the front. And I go, I hate this right now, but it's my privilege to run at the front. And I repeat that like a mantra because I don't enjoy running, but it is very good for me. So those are some of the things that keep me grounded.
I think for me, something you mentioned sticks out because it's one of my groundings too. And it's like having people around you. And I don't need 10,000 friends. I need 3 bad motherfuckers as one.
What's his name?
One comedian.
Yeah. The guy from The Sopranos.
It's an Italian comedian. I don't know if did he play on The Sopranos?
Yeah, I think so. Didn't he?
I don't know. I don't think so. I watched The Sopranos. I don't remember him.
Whatever. He's an Italian guy. That's probably why I'm just like associating it.
The comedian that says that and that's all I need. And Trappist in the book, I called him Thomas earlier, but Trappist in the book, the one who takes care of the kids, he sees quote as a human being, and quote responds to that and understands that because this is the first time in like 3 years that somebody's looked at him like a human being, apart from the farmer that tried to help him. But still, this is the first time in 3 years that somebody looks at him like a human being and he feels a connection there of sorts. That to me has always been a grounding. The time of my life that I'm thinking about is 2014. And for those listeners who have been with us since episode 1, because I think I mentioned this maybe in episode 10, 2014 for me was extraordinarily difficult time. And it was financially and my career, identity, the whole thing that I've been building for the past 8 years of that moment just fell apart. And there was definite, clear silver linings where even though that fell apart, the career I'm in now started a few months before. So when I moved and I got out of the situation, I was able to get a job fairly quickly because I had already established myself even in the few months as a good marketing professional, a talented marketing professional. So there wasn't that much of a burden like with Quoth where everything fell apart. I still had my wife. I still had 1 or 2 friends that kept me grounded that I could chat with or invite over to dinner, hang out, have a beer, have 7, whatever, right? I think having people around you, having that community is a lifeline. It's essential. And what books are for you now, that's what books were for me when I was a young kid. Because I didn't have any friends when I was a young kid. I was a bit of a loner. My mom was a recluse. I was a scrawny little nerd. So books were my only escape. So I totally understand how you could get lost in a story like Quoth's and identify with the character and identify even with his hubris and his young man stupidity and the drive to find out what the hell happened.
Yeah, it's deeply important for humans to have things to reground themselves because this is not some sort of dark prophecy over your life, but suffering is in your future. It sucks. It's just the way that it is. When that stuff happens, and maybe suffering for you is just change. Change is difficult. Change is hard. But even in moments of change, you have to find ways to reground. And whatever you have to do to reground, I implore you to find the things to help you do that, whatever those things might be. Preferably that they're somewhat healthy, not drinking and smoking to oblivion, but certainly some of that is, I think, fine. Personally, yeah. So doing things that both embrace the present and help you process it, but not let you escape it, whatever those things are.
And for Quoth, before we move on, Trappist, I'm convinced, was that while he was the street wave. Because he says it, meaning Trappist's little basement hospital, whatever it was, it helped when I was out on the rooftops alone, knowing that Trappist and the basement were there. It was almost like a home you could come back to. Almost. Having that thing, or people, hopefully that thing involves people, but having that thing that you're talking about, the grounding, is essential for a person not to go into oblivion.
Yeah.
Whether it's with drugs, drink, or just, your everyday run-of-the-mill depression.
Yeah, I agree. It's well, we've already said it a couple times. As to quote Slava, I am belaboring the point. But let's zoom out here for a half second. And I want to ask Slava, I haven't ever read a story like this before where we focus on a character and the whole character's story is about his failure. I suppose to simplify my question, have you ever read a story before where the main character is entirely a failure?
No, not to my recollection. This is the first story like it. When I first read it, I don't think I fully grasped that as a thing of the story. I was just reading some kid having adventures. He got into some trouble. He's a little shit sometimes, and he's had a difficult life. There's this event that has shaken his whole world, the death of his family. I was reading, but I wasn't reading, kind of in below the script, if you will. And later on, as you and I talked, and I had to reread the book for this time around, that's when that thing, I'm a linguist here, that came to the forefront, more so. So I can't think of another book like this where the main character, to use your words, is a failure, and he has to deal with his failings.
What do you think about Red, though, from...
Roadside Picnic?
Yes, thank you.
He doesn't go through the same existential crises as Quoth
Okay,
does.
all right, that's fair, I guess. I'm just thinking about, his life kind of feels like a failure, but it's also written by Russians, so, you guys are, the epitome of joy, so...
Yes, we are. Don't you ever forget it. Joy is what we embody.
There, that's a better way to say it. Russians are the embodiment of joy. Oh, man.
But let's get some fun questions here, or take on a lighter tone in our conversation.
Sure.
Well, before we do that, let's start with a half fun, half serious question. What do you think about the Chandrian? Do they scare you? The character build-up so far, and I know you read this book and you read the second book. Pretend you haven't. But how does the setup, and maybe you'll have a better answer for me because you read both books, and maybe there's no real answer right now until we get the third one. Hint, hint, wink, wink.
Uh-huh.
Let's just start with that. Do the Chandrians scare you?
They do, but mostly because we don't know enough about them. So the implication, sort of, is that Lanray is somehow part of the Chandrian, but he got transformed because of his friend. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Vaguely, yes.
I might be messing the names up. So maybe you could look it up and correct me if I'm wrong, because I want to be right enough, And I realize this isn't in the first part of the book, so forgive us. But, yeah, so there's these ancient beings who wielded real power in the book, and Lanray comes back from the dead, and then his friend basically is Job's comforters, if you understand the reference, and is not really a friend or a comforter. His wife dies, even though he came back from the dead shortly after, and he's miserable. And he decides that there's no more joy in the world and kind of goes on a rampage, and his friend condemns him to shadow because he knows his true name. And that's the only origin we have for Haliax, from what we can tell. And then there's a band of 6 others. And there's only one more book. There's just too much to find out. We don't know. So yeah, that's my rubbish of an answer, I suppose. My attempt at an oral answer for you. What about you? Do they scare you?
I like being scared. I like creep. I like horror.
You'd probably join them.
I might. They seem like fun folks. And really, murdering a whole family once in a while is a small price to pay.
The cost of eternal life.
And I looked up the thing you said. I think you're right.
Yeah, it's Lanray, right? Like Lanray has his eye plucked out, and oh no, his friend plucks his eye out and says, "I didn't see basically the bitterness in your heart, and I should have." And then we spoke briefly about how Rothfuss employs ancient mythologies like Egyptian with, is it Osiris's eye? No, the Eye of Horus, right? Eye of Horus, Norse mythology. What was another one you mentioned?
Egyptian, Norse, and there seems to be biblical overtones here and there.
Yeah, that's less of Lanray's specific mythology, but yes, I think. Because of the eye part in particular that I was focused on. Anyway, Lanray becomes Haliax. I guess the simple version is yes, the Chandrian do scare me because we don't know enough about them, but they're very, very powerful beings. You join your band of roaming horde nomads who have eternal life for some reason and lots of power and go,
Right.
slaughter the countryside or something.
What did I tell you? I just need 3 bad motherfuckers. Well, now I have 6, and
7.
we maybe occasionally murder a town or something.
More, or a wedding, or a family,
or whatever. Yeah, well, hey, keep your songs in the right playlist order, and everything will be fine.
Yes, that was the issue. They turned Spotify on incorrectly. They put shuffle on it, and the artist really wanted it to be played in a specific order.
We prefer that you listen on Apple Music.
Okay, all right. Well, here's a fun question for you because you can't get away from the macabre. Who's your favorite master so far and why?
Oh, that is a good question. I like the fishery guy, and I like the guy that was all aloof and asked Quoth to jump off the roof.
Elodin?
Elodin, yeah. I like those 2 so far.
Kilvin and Elodin?
Yeah, I like Kilvin. Kilvin just seems like a fun guy. And Elodin just seems like a bit of a lunatic. So, for those 2 reasons, and you know me well enough to understand this.
Yeah. A fun lunatic. Great.
Do you have one that you like more than the rest? I think I might. Let me guess. And
You want to guess? Yeah, I just see it on your face. Your face is squinting, and you're like, I think it's...
You like the headmaster.
Yes, Lava. I like the dorkiest of them all, who has to wrangle all of the cats and keep them from fighting students. That's my favorite one. Good guess, Lava. Thank you. I'm glad you feel like I have a very ornate personality. You jackwagon.
It just seems like you would like him.
Why? Tell me why.
Well, he keeps everything in order.
Uh-huh.
He does wrangle the cats.
He beats students with a whip.
It seems in your life he does. You have a propensity towards violence. Not a lot of people know this, but especially against teenagers. You like to hit them.
Oh, man.
I don't know who hurt you.
A teenager.
But,
Middle school.
there you go. It all comes out in the
does.
wash. No, but seriously, who do you
It's
who do
a
you
loaded.
love?
It unravels more in book 2, but he speaks in the philosophical poetry that I really like of like, okay, you think you understand names? What's that color? Blue? Well, what does blue mean? And he just like, he wraps Quoth up and like makes him sit down. Sit, go find 3 pine cones. And then he comes back and he's gone. Throw yourself off this roof. He does. I'd never teach someone to throw themselves off this roof. And like Quoth has to know the difference between when he's being sarcastic and when he's testing him, and he doesn't. He has no idea.
Well, that's why I like Loden. He's fun.
Right. He also knows the names.
I forgot the 3 pine cones.
He knows names.
Yeah.
He's my favorite. But Kilvin's a close second. And we do get the most time with them. I thought at first when you were guessing, you were going to guess that it was Master Lauren with his books. Or even funnier, the guy that Quoth does malfeasance on, whose name escapes me at the moment.
Yeah, he's a dweeb.
Yeah, I thought you...
Oh, you burned me.
Yeah.
Oh, well, whatever.
Puts on... He's like probably besties with Ambrose and his father.
Probably. I wouldn't put it past him.
Yeah, probably. But here's a cooking question for you.
Ooh.
So, of Quoth's friends, which one would you like to cook a meal for and have a conversation with? Right? Like,
Yeah, Wilhelm.
you can't steal my answer. Okay, I'll pick Davy. It's not really close friend, but she seems like she has a lot of stories.
I think Willem. I mean, Fella sounds fun too. She seems like a sweet person. But if his close friends, Willem. He's sarcastic and he's a foreigner. So Willem.
Yeah, he's got a thick accent. Willem was my first choice. Also, I don't know if your wife would be comfortable if Fella came over for dinner. Apparently, she's deeply beautiful.
Well, I have plenty of female friends, and my wife's okay with this, unless Fella began bringing over cloaks and hugging me every other meal that I cook her. Then
I was thinking more of Fella when she was, at her dorm door, covered in merely a sheet. But whatever.
oh yeah, in my fantasy, Fella is fully dressed, and I'm just cooking her a meal.
That's good. Just checking. Just checking.
Although she can bring over gifts, I'll take gifts.
Especially if it's a cloak with many pockets. I would actually wear something like that. So,
Yeah, I can see that. I can see why you're made fun of as a kid too.
that's not the only reason. Haven't you seen my ninja photos on the book?
No,
Oh, well, never mind then. Never mind.
I mean I'd like to. If I can get him for us audience, they'll be in the they'll be in the Google Drive.
No, 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 no. You're not gonna dox me on the old internet here.
I'd keep him for myself. Oh goodness. There you have it, folks. That was the main quest of a podcast called Side Quest.
One last note in the maid quest here. A lot of people who have read this book usually have read the second one. We will present that to Slava as quickly as we can, but the question that everybody has is book 3. When is it coming out? And frankly, I think Rothfuss is. I think it's written. I think it's been in revision for way too long. I'm saying that as an audience member who wants to read it, not the author who feels the weight of an entire fan base who's waiting for it, which I'm sure is heavier. So certainly compassion for him on that. And he has in his live streams regularly vented about people harassing him for book 3. And I don't know, I'm kind of split on it. I definitely understand him being harassed on it. He's not technically obligated to write that for us. I think it's written.
Well, here's the thing. It's the internet. You have to just go with the punches. Like, you and I have talked about this at some length
Mm-hmm.
about trolls on the internet and the vitriol that you got for your stupid watch-alongs.
Mm-hmm.
Like, who cares? If anybody ever sees our face when we finally go public, meaning like this thing grows beyond us and just us doing this on the side, if this thing ever kicks off far beyond where we are now into something substantial, into a big thing, right? Our faces will be out there, and I'm sure we'll get crap for our faces and crap for the way we sit in front of the mic and everything that we talk about. And if we keep growing our audience as we are, then at least 2 of them are going to be trolls. It's just the nature of the internet. You can't escape that. But they're just those types of people that like to stir the pot on the internet. Times that by a couple of million for Rothfuss, and you're going to get assholes saying crap to you.
Mm-hmm.
So I can sympathize, but if you promised, you promised. And if it's taking you 10 years, well, be prepared to get some shit for it.
True. True, true, true.
All the love to Rothfuss. Publish the book. Even though I won't read it for another, 8 months because we're in a schedule.
Yes, that's true. But as we wind down here, Slava, do you have any unanswered questions?
Unanswered questions. That is a fantastic question. I want to know more about how Quoth and Bast met.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the one that's been bothering me.
Yeah, we don't get that in book 2 or in the recently re-released The Lightning Tree, which is called something else now. The Lightning Tree was like a short story that kind of became a novella that Rothfuss wrote, which is about Bast in town doing things that Bast does, similar to the slow regard for silent things about Ari and the Under thing. They're not written the same at all, but they're the same style where it's like a character piece.
That'd be my only question right now, because
You don't want to know about the Doors of Stone?
won't I be told that in the next book?
Not in book 2.
Oh.
That's a book 3 thing that we still don't know.
Well, what about those Doors of Stone? Wouldn't mind knowing a
Wow.
little bit about them, I guess.
Wow. Thanks. Wah, wah.
But a question for the real world is, has Jonathan ever chased a girl across
Oh,
Lands.
man.
lands and
It's kind of
states?
hoping you forgot about that text.
Oh, you don't want to talk about it now?
You're asking if I've got a Denna in my past?
Yes,
I do.
I know you do.
Yeah, because you know her.
Yes, I was there when she invited me to her wedding. Close not to you.
Yeah, true. She showed up at my brother's bachelor party the night she got engaged.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Weren't you there at the lounge we went to?
Is that when we find out she was engaged?
Uh-huh.
Oh, cool. Well, I was partying with your brother and all that entails.
No, that's fine, yeah. But celebration would have been preferred in that moment for me. Yeah, that was a tough night for me. Yeah, how do we make this short? Actually, quick side quest on that. Her brother's band was playing when I was at the hardware store on the 4th, building a closet.
Huh.
So,
A quick side quest upon a side quest. Her brother's band knows Passenger, who I am
that doesn't surprise me.
big fan of. So I am 3 degrees away from Passenger. For anybody who likes Passenger, who cares
Sure, okay.
about my nonsensical side
I
quest
mean,
here?
we both are, because I know her brother as well. Anyway, doesn't
Yeah.
matter. Yeah, well, the short version of this story would be, loveless, longing, and looking, to use alliteration, in vein of Rothfuss. And that would describe 6 or 8 years, I don't remember how long it was, of chasing an Australian girl across America. And unbeknownst to me, similar to Kvothe, I didn't know I was in love with her for the first 2/3 of that. But everyone else seemed to.
Funny how that works out.
Everyone else, and even Kvothe's friends are like, why don't you just tell her you like her? And man, it gets me every time. Kvothe's like, well, I don't want to lose her as a friend because all the other guys. And I was like, oh, buddy. Man, really hits close to home.
Yeah. Well, I didn't mean to open up any scabs.
No. It's been long enough. I'm happily married to a woman who's not flighty, and I'll save the rest of my commentary for off air. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. I'm happily married to someone who deserves my time.
Yeah,
Call it that.
and loves you back.
Yes, that's true.
I didn't mean that the way it came out, but
Well, it's still true. It's still true. But yeah, unrequited love is a real burden to bear, and I would encourage you, any audience member who has unrequited love, if you've made your pass and they said no, believe them and move on. Do not tarry in the lands of loveless longing and looking like I did.
it's fun and romantic with a small R and air quotes around it in a book like Name of the Wind, but in real life, it's not that great.
It's heart-wrenching and traumatizing and debilitating and crippling, and has the potential to ruin future relationships because you can't get over something from the past where this person is already married and doesn't actually talk to you anymore. Not that I have any experience in these things.
No.
Just off the top of my head.
Yeah, right. You read in a blog or something.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, I think I've been fortunate to escape this because I just don't have a lot of sentimentality in me. But I've been close. I've been very tangentially positioned in these situations. This doesn't make me a better person or anything like that, but me seeing things go sideways, my ego played too big of a role, and I was like, yep, okay, well, I'm done. See you all. But
Well, it probably kept you safe from some of the stuff that I went through. So,
Yeah.
for all the decommissioning that people try to do to their egos, perhaps this is one of the times when it saved you.
a healthy dose of self-worth is not only empowering, but it sets up really good boundaries in a myriad of situations. So pride and an overinflated ego are a bad thing, but a good sense of self-worth, understanding you yourself as a human being having worth and what you bring to a situation or a relationship, whatever the hell the situation is, being able to assess that and say, nope, this is not for me. I gotta go. This is a waste of my time. Whatever the situation is.
Right, exactly.
Good. But we digress.
That's a great transition into the final segment of the first episode of books that we're having, which is Kvoth's self-worth. And I think that we see other characters have self-worth issues in fantasy books and other genres. But what makes it different in The Name of the Wind is that we get to see the contrast of his self-worth. And I think that this is simply a feature, I guess I'd call it, of the Bill Dukes-Roman framework. Because when you get to see a character between childhood and they have higher self-esteem versus adulthood and they have lower self-esteem, if I can call it that, it adds a contrast and a juxtaposition that I think is sobering, but I also like Kvothe, even though he's full of hubris and full of ego. So that was a good transition there, Slava. To tie this all together, we are going to step into the next half, the second half of Name of the Wind, next episode, where we'll talk about characters, another literary device or two, a tasting menu, if you will, of things that we liked and hot takes on spicy things that we didn't like, as well as more plot discussion on what takes place in The Name of the Wind in the second half of the book and what else we discover. So thank you for joining us on the first episode using our new format. We certainly want to know what you think about it, and we hope that you'll drop that in the comments for us.
And take a moment to rate the show on your favorite podcast platform and share it with your book-loving friends. And we'll see you next time on SideQuest.